going to have to be a massive structural transformation in our consumption and production patterns, which is going to have to represent a massive shift in the way we conceive government and the division of government and non-government in the use of resources, in the imposition of regulations and policy coercion on non-government activity. That's not a cyclical shift. And we should therefore not be trying to sort of be cute with history and call it a New Deal. So that's why I prefer green transition. That's what we're calling it. And I'll say who we are in a moment, in general terms. And I think that we can avoid that cultural artefact from the United States in our own country. So this is a neoliberal support report card. I think I'm just going to just put it up there because the gentleman that spoke earlier, read out his speech, told us all about it. The housing person told us all about it. Alison told us all about it. We've heard it for 2 days. We've lived it. We know it. And what we've come to know is that across a whole range of things that matter to us, the report card is a failure. It's a dramatic failure. And the final conclusion is that it's a social and environmental failure. It's just not an environmental failure. And the two are intrinsically interlinked, and they're interlinked with that second last dot point, that they're interlinked with, as a major policy failure, with the government surplus, and government is both sides of politics in this country, not just the Conservatives. The Labor Party are unelectable in this country because they've got these surplus obsessions. They don't even understand what surpluses are, really. They don't understand the damage that surpluses do. They don't understand that surpluses destroy non-government wealth, our wealth, but they pursue it notwithstanding, and that pursuit has created such a narrow policy space that it's allowed all sorts of things that should have been done for many years to not be done, and we're in this position. So we've got a crisis. I think it was Alison said something about a war. We've got a crisis. It was the housing lady. We've got a war on our hands. Crisis means crisis. Now, why not rely on the market? Well, what I mean by this is if you look at the policy platforms of our three major parties, they've all got variations of market-based solutions to the climate crisis. All of them. And what I mean by a market-based solution, it's working through what economists call the price system. And so what you need to do, what they say is, well, the reason we've got a climate crisis is because the price of carbon-using activities is not reflective of the true cost. And so all we need to do is really adjust the price so that it reflects the true costs, and then via substitution by consumers, as the product prices of those outputs rise, consumers will substitute away and we'll get a optimal in economic language, not my language, but mainstream economic language. We'll get an optimal mix of polluting activities and non-polluting activities. Now the reason that's what we mean by a market system, well that's just the neoliberal way of thinking, that everything can be done through a market. And it amounts to a conception that our atmosphere could be privatised. And if you understand the literature and the practical experience of offset schemes, carbon offset schemes, that's a big debate in Australia. We'll have offsets. Well, if you examine, and I urge you to become familiar with the earliest type of these trading schemes, which was in the European Union scheme, the way in which the offset schemes in third world countries, less developed countries, have operated have been disastrous for local communities, local cultures, local sustainability. So it amounts to big polluters in rich countries doing some stuff in less rich countries, wrecking them, and then claiming them as credit so that they can keep polluting in the rich countries. And this is all market-based, being disastrous. And market insensitive to equity issues. So one of the first things you learn as a progressive young economist is that price systems are invariant to the distributional matters. Because in the market all that matters is the price and the vote is the dollar that you bring to the market, and so who's got the most dollars will get the best votes in the market. And as a progressive person, I don't want a system to be relying on a system that doesn't take equity and put equity as a primary decision-making criteria on. And most importantly, and why it's involved, is that my profession has this idea of this trade-off, that you have an optimal amount of pollution regulated or mediated through the price system. As long as the prices are appropriately scaled to the true cost, then you'll get an optimal amount of pollution. That's what you get taught in second year microeconomics, third year, and then by the time you graduate, you're writing equations about the same thing, nothing much, no substance, just a lot of hocus. And Paul Sweezy once said, by the way, that mainstream economics basically converts you into an idiot in first year, someone who's basically just full of jargon, and then by fifth year you just write mathematics for it. And so the point is that markets are insensitive to biological systems. I don't know when a river system's going to die. There is no conception that an economist who designs a market system, they can't tell you when a biological system's going to collapse. So there's no scientific way of assessing a trade-off. There's no such thing as an optimal amount of pollution. In other words, we have to be incredibly cautious in our behaviour, incredibly risk-averse, and not rely on the price system and think it's all going to be fine if we just match prices with costs. And so I've always advocated for many years that I've been working in this policy area, a rules-based approach, using the legislative and regulative capacity of our federal governments through the constitutional system to state and local governments. And a rules-based approach doesn't rely on price system, it relies on us making decisions that are in the best interests of the society, and using the legislative capacity of our governments to then tell industry and groups what they're going to do. And an application for that, I live in mostly in Newcastle. It's the largest export coal port in the world. All day, every day, the coal's getting shunted out. And it comes from up the Hunter Valley, of course, on the trains. And my approach to that issue, give them a sunset clause, 10 years, 20 years, as advised by proper climate science, not by me, I haven't got a clue. And we just tell them they're shutting down, that's it, end. And when I've said that, started saying that quite a bit younger than I am now, there'd be death threats from unions turning up telling me that I won't mention the union, you can guess which one it is. And in that type of rules-based approach, the government becomes a central player as a voice for us, not as an autocratic, coercive policy, agent, but as a voice for us. And that, of course, requires substantial political reform in our democratic processes. So we're adding layers of complexity as I go through this talk. Now, the other thing is I hear is this idea that, and I have sympathy for it, but no time for it. And the idea is that, look, we've got a climate crisis on our hands, and if we try to marry that to some liberal social agenda, like fair work, like good wages, like good retirement conditions, like good schooling, good hospitals, good public transport, all the things that a progressive social democrat would desire in our societies, the argument is if we try to marry the climate action with that, then we'll just get rid of the right wing will never buy into it. But if we just keep focus on the climate issue, everybody can buy into that and we'll make action. So we leave the liberal, social, progressive agenda aside, forget it, and just solve the climate problem. But if you go back to the report card, my hypothesis and assertion is that the climate issue can't be divorced from the social issue, that it's causally linked. And so if we really want to truly solve the climate issue in a progressive way, with equity up there at the top, fairness. You know, I grew up in Australia where we were told we had the fair go here. We were an egalitarian society. It's one of the many delusions that Australians have of ourselves. We're a vindictive, pernicious, individualistic society, and we've got to stop that. And I'm not sure that was worthy of a clap because it really makes me upset. And the point is that therefore it's got to be a joint attack on the problem. That what we're really talking about here is an attack on neoliberalism. Not getting sidetracked into being focused just on climate issues. It's what we've got to mount as progressives is an attack on neoliberalism. Now then the question, and the complexity goes up a bit further, then the question is, are we talking about here challenging the very basis of the capitalist mode of production? That's what we're talking about. Are we talking now about system change? And, well, I've got my views on that, and I'm sure they're not necessarily the same as everybody's views, but that's a question that I don't think we talk about much. You know, we'll have a little bit of an emission trading system here and stuff like that, but I think we've got to think about fundamentally redefining our productive system. And so we talk about just transition, feeding into climate action. You'll note that I've now got the people and the social element as the starting point, because unless we alter human behaviour and give people an incentive to change their behaviour, we're not going to get climate action. Now, we can get it if we lock everybody up who turns on a light switch too often, but we don't want that sort of society. So we've got to address the vicissitudes of neoliberalism on social grounds to get the climate action. And that's what I'm calling green transition. Now, I first started thinking about this in the mid-90s when I came across the work of Brian Kohler, who was a trade union official in Canada, and that particular union were fighting major issues with respect to closure of very polluting plants that had a lot of chemical pollution. And Brian Kohler said, the real choice is not jobs or environment, it is both or neither. And what he was saying was, it's a bit of text, that if you really go into a community where the workers' lives are dependent for their mortgages, for their self-esteem, for their status, for their relativities, for their children's future, for their retirement, and all of the things that all of us care about, if you go into a community where those workers are working in a polluting plant and you just lobby to get the plant shut down, then those workers are likely to resist and join up political forces with the bosses who don't, with capital. You'll get a merger of labour and capital fighting against that, and you probably won't get what you want. And in a way in Australia we've got that in the coal industry, with the big multinational coal companies and the CFMEU. And I can completely understand the resistance of the CFMEU to closing down coal at this stage, because the issue is being constructed as closing down the livelihoods of all those workers and giving them nothing in return. And I've had a lot of struggles with the Greens over my career, where they'll go into a community, say in Victoria, New South Wales, depending where I was living at the time, saying we can't keep cutting down those forests for timber, and then they go back to Sydney. And of course the communities are not going to buy into that. That's their livelihoods. And that's what Brian Kohler was saying. And that was the genesis of the concept of just transition. And in a few years later, my research centre started doing work for Greenpeace at the beginning on closing down coal-fired power stations in New South Wales. And we started to build the concept of a just transition framework in the early 2000s, based upon this notion that jobs had to be up front and alternatives had to be provided or you get nowhere. Now this is our little matrix that we're currently, this is our green transition framework. And let's quickly go through it. Transparency and planning. This morning some people were talking about consultation and inclusion in decision making. We're not going to get anywhere unless communities, unless the process is legitimate, which means that the communities have to buy into it and be part of the process and be fully informed. We need planning. You know, I grew up in a time where we had elaborate federal government and regional labour market and regional plans, state government regional plans. And of course in the 1980s, once Hawke and Keating got their hands on the levers, and then that neoliberalism morphed into Howard and Costello and so on. They abandoned all of that planning environment, the occupational planning, the skill development planning that was feeding into a full employed economy, the regional development plan to match the social settlement with the economic settlement. That was all banned because the market would do it. Well, that planning is a dirty word for neoliberalism, because what it implies is that capital, and particularly multinational capital, are going to have to not run wild and do what they want. And now we've got state governments with these PPPs that have really outsourced urban infrastructure planning to private equity groups. And that's got to stop. Funding and logistics support. Now this is tied into these, a lot of these are all interlinked. This is going to require massive investments. And it's only our federal government as the currency issuer who's going to have the financial capacity to do this. So and it's highly likely that for many years, fiscal deficits will have to be substantial. See you later, surplus obsession. You'll never achieve it with surplus obsession. And I was in Europe recently talking to some of the big investment banks, and they're telling me their big thing is green bonds. And I was on a panel with a Greens leader in a particular country, I won't say which one, and she said, what we've got to do, this is the Greens, what we've got to do is get the financial markets involved. Well, the last thing we want is the financial markets to commodify this process for themselves. If the financial markets get their hands on any of this, see you later. And so reducing financial barriers is about small cooperatives and startups and failing because of lack of working capital. And we need a framework where we provide startup money for cooperatives that are community-based, the old cooperative model, where workers have the power and the decision-making capacity of communities are sitting on the decision-making boards. I'm not talking about giving handouts to large corporations who are part of the problem. Public banks and pensions, this is related to financing. My view is that the Australian government should tomorrow put legislation to nationalise the banking system. The banks are essentially guaranteed by our government. We've been following in the Royal Commission, and even though the Royal Commission was straitjacketed by the government, so that it limited its terms of reference and cut it short. It could have gone on for 5 years, I reckon, what they didn't discover yet. The banks are essentially corrupt, self-serving, and don't advance public purpose, and we don't need them. We can have public bank, no problem. But if in the transition, then we have to have major regulative changes to our banking sector, such that every asset they create has to stay on their balance sheet and can't become a speculative asset, a derivative asset. If we want to do that, banks can't speculate on food, which they do currently, buying up, participating in derivative products that buy up corn stocks, for example, store them, hold them long, so waiting for the price to rise, and starving communities in poorer countries who depend upon that corn for nutrition. All of that's got to stop. Removing price distortions. In the interim, we may want to have a carbon tax. Now, I don't necessarily weight all these things equally. These are just parts of a credible story. And this is these price distortions are the factory that's pumping out the smoke doesn't pay for the damage to the environment. And the carbon tax idea is you make them pay for that, the price of their product goes up, consumers shift away from that product to something that's cheaper, and then that reduces the output of that stuff. We might want to do that. We need massive R&D, and that means we've got to rethink our university system, the sector that I've worked in all my life. And you know, my own university gets money from guess who to do guess what. Even though there's no such thing as clean coal, but we've got to pump a lot of money, public money, that's motivated by public purpose, not advancing private profit, into the university and research centres like CSIRO and what have you, to build a scientific and technological base to allow us to do this stuff. Redeployment and relocation. The reality is that some regions are not going to be viable. And we need to have, one of the problems of deindustrialisation has been that, you know, people like me have an international labour market. My job vacancies could be everywhere. I've got a job in Finland. And I have no financial barriers to getting on driving or getting on a plane and going anywhere. Professional people don't. And I can almost, not almost because I probably couldn't afford to live in Sydney, but most professional people don't have housing issues that we heard earlier today, just before. Whereas low-income workers, who are the ones who suffer the disproportionate loss of jobs and opportunity when a region is being deindustrialised, are stuck there because they can't afford to move into a new housing area where jobs might be, into a new region. And so if a worker wants to make it, and by the way, most people don't want to relocate, and that comes back soon. We need jobs where, you know, this is the matching of the social and the economic settlement. Economic settlements where jobs and activity are, social settlements are where we live with our families. And historically we've tried to match them through regional development plans. And in the market era, that's fractured now. So out in New South Wales, for example, a lot of those towns are becoming a geriatric holding cell. As the young people have moved, the services are thinning out, distance to a grocer is now getting massive, doctors and lawyers have left, probably good that the lawyers have gone, and the people are just getting older. And that's because we've got this mismatch between the two different settlements that are important parts of our lives. So the government has to create redeployment and relocation structures. Skill development is going to be important. And I hear quite a lot of people say, oh, well, MMT supports low-skilled jobs. Well, whoever said that? I was one of the founders. Whoever said that? What's likely, and if you watch that video from yesterday, Warren and I, we talk about high-skilled work. And my understanding is the sort of jobs that are going to be required in a renewable green economy are going to be quite high-skilled, requiring a lot of discretion and a lot of talent and a lot of capacity. Well, we heard before earlier about the demolition of our vocational training system. It's shocking what's happening. Not long ago I was consulted by a private employment provider who was providing IT skill development, and the bastard told me that they had Windows 98 on their computers. No, I don't use Windows, but that's pretty old. So we're going to have to revitalise our whole skill development system. That means apprentices and other vocational areas. And what I mean by apprentices are not the 2 bob apprentices that the Howard government brought in, the McDonald's apprentices. We need real skills again. Not the apprenticeships you can get in 12 weeks. We're going to have massive public infrastructure. Now, it took me 5 hours of flying to get here from Newcastle the other day. And I go to Melbourne regularly for work, and that takes me several hours. Well, what? It's already known that I could get to Melbourne from Newcastle in 3 hours at a cost recovery price of $70 if we had a high-speed train. The other day I was went from Tokyo to Kyoto. It's about 260k. We got there in just over 2 hours, I think. No, that's not true. No, it's about 680k and we got there in 2 hours. That's it. And I did the calculation. It takes 3 hours to get from Newcastle to Sydney by train at present. Well, I could get there in 38 minutes on a high-speed train. And since I've been an adult, there's been debates about high-speed train in Australia, and the government says we can never afford it. Well, if there's enough steel and some workers who can lay it, then we can afford it because the government can buy anything that it wants that's available for sale. And so I'm talking here about big public infrastructure. Public sector job creation. Now you'll note that 12 is job guarantee and 10 is public sector job creation. They're not the same thing. Because when I was younger, the public sector played a major employment role in skilled, professional, technical, sub-professional, unskilled job creation. You could always get a job in the public sector. And in Australian history, the skill development arm of our labour market and the public employment arm were intrinsically linked because the private employers have never done much skill development. So where did the Qantas and TAA and ANZET get their pilots from? The RAF. Where did all the private construction companies get their builders from? The apprenticeships offered by housing and industry. And roads and railways and transport and all the rest of it. And so we shouldn't be scared, and we should advocate that we want a larger public sector and a larger public employment presence, developing employment opportunities not based upon whether it's going to provide returns to a narrow shareholding group that many of which are overseas residents. And that's not any xenophobia being expressed there, it's a class comment. And we shouldn't be worried that we want a whole stack of public activities doing stuff that helps the green transition and provides good jobs, secure jobs, all the things that Alison was talking about. Public partnerships, I hear this relates back to funding and logistics support, reducing financial barriers. These are partnerships between small cooperative startups, progressive community organisations and public sector. Public sector's got the money, has got strategic capacity, has got architectural capacity, has got engineering capacity. The public sector in this case includes universities with all the research capacity. They can help small communities develop stuff. And finally, one of the things that comes, and I said this yesterday, I think, I keep hearing the Green New Deal is going to be solved by job guarantee. Well, the job guarantee is a buffer stock to provide an option for workers in our community who typically bear the brunt of unemployment. It's not meant to be a solution to the sort of scale that we're talking about here, and the sort of skill development and the training and the innovation and the nous that we're going to require. The job guarantee is an essential equity and inflation fighting measure, but it shouldn't be asked to do too much. All right, last few points. So that's a big thing, isn't it? And that big thing, which is massive, and when I think about the social and the economic sort of labour market issues involved in that, I say to myself, well, if the climate change scientists are right, well then we're pretty cool, because this is going to take quite a long time. And it's going to require massive transformations, and the losers of all of that, because there's going to be people losing, there's going to be communities losing, and so we have to, you'll note that I didn't talk about climate there at all, but all of that's related to climate. But what that framework allows us to do is to make sure there are no losers. The ones that lose their jobs now know that this framework's going to be able to provide them with an ongoing sustainable future. Now, I understand the arguments the CFMEU make to me that a coal worker does not want to become a checkout operator. But that's not what we're talking about at all. You know, we put a person on the moon when I was still in high school. You imagine the technological challenge that was before all of the sort of networking and scientific capacity we've got now. If we can do it then, we can create with our imagination really good transition opportunities for skilled workers. And we know how we're going to pay for it, that's MMT. Now, last few slides, and this is sort of a semi-announcement. What I've concluded with some others is that our major political parties are basically moribund. That the Greens are problematic, and there's all sorts of reasons why this is the case. But that's relying on the Greens to be the climate action, green transition political force. I wouldn't rely on that. And what we need to change all of that and to reinvigorate our political parties so that they become voices for us again, whether they were, I'm not sure, but I think they were when I was younger, a bit more than they are now, particularly the Labor Party. What we need, in my view, is a new coalition that marries MMT to the social and environment elements that I've been talking about. And we also need to start with the recognition that if we abandon the elements that are going to lose out initially from this transformation, that tie all of those communities together, then we won't make any progress. So the priority's got to be jobs. Now, how many people know about the Power Manifesto 1971? I won't get to stand up. A very small number. Lewis Powell was an American lawyer. He was hired by the Chamber of Commerce in the United States to, all the debate in the late 60s and was about the profit squeeze, it was called. It was how the social democratic system had empowered trade unions, had empowered people to want more out of the income that was being produced by the economy. And there was more of that going to workers and labour, and that was squeezing the profit share. And capital was saying this is unsustainable, we need more. When did they ever say less? And I've done a lot of work over the years for the unions on the national wage case. There's never been once that I've understood that the workers would get a pay increase if it was up to the employees. And what Lewis Powell was commissioned to do was come up with a strategic agenda to wrest back control from what they called the communists and the socialists. This was just normal working people. And Powell came up with this blueprint, and I urge all progressives to read it, because we can almost cut and paste our version into it to be a progressive manifesto. What Lewis Powell, and by the way, it was just after he published this, he was appointed by President Nixon to the Supreme Court, and he was arguably the most conservative Supreme Court judge in American history. So he was a right. You're allowed to swear, but I won't these days. And, you know, his manifesto, we've got to create think tanks. And that was the era of all the think tanks started to be created. In Australia, we got CIS and the, you know, H.R. Nichols Society, if you remember. You'll remember that, Jeff. Yep. And in America, you know, had all these think tanks really growing and getting well funded by capital, industrial capital, the Koch brothers, Wall Street, Peter Peterson, all of these propaganda machines, which were extremely well funded, which were extremely well staffed with very skilled researchers and operators, which were extremely well staffed with high quality marketing and journalist capacity, who would pump out research all the time to alter the debate. He also advocated infiltrating the education system, particularly the social sciences, to weed out the communists and to start an educational narrative that would promote free market capitalism. And as a funny aside, some years ago I came across a CIA document from the late 60s. And for all you Marxists, you'll get a kick out of this. I did. So you know about the rise of Continental Marxism and Foucault and all the rest of it, which became rather abstruse for a basic industrial Marxist like me. Very postmodern. You know, what it was and these guys started, these French and Continental Marxists started to appear all around the world, holding workshops and espousing these ideas that were virtually incomprehensible. Anyway, it was later, it's now been revealed that the CIA was sponsoring them because they knew they were so wacky that it would turn everybody off who had any tendency to become Marxists. It would turn them off. This was all part of this strategy. And the other thing Powell said, there were other things, but the other main thing was that the right had to create a media presence, a mass media presence. And that's where you get Fox News from. And whatever else you got, Sky News and Murdoch's and those sort of things. And the right have always been really united in being able to do that sort of stuff. They seem to be able to put their factional differences and their personal differences aside and be extremely sophisticated in their strategies. Now, it's helped that they've got a lot of money. The left has never been really good at understanding that sort of strategic challenge. And the left usually fractures. I remember when I was a student in Melbourne in the 70s, there were three communist parties. Trots, Maoists and Marxist-Leninists. And the Trots would march into political economy conferences with megaphones shouting, "We've got to close this down, the Marxist-Leninists are here." And we fracture. We divert our energy and our empowerment by fighting among ourselves too often. So here is what I'm planning to do about it. These are the goals. Green transition, with all of those elements in that matrix I showed you. And that's contestable, the matrix, but that's just a thought experiment at this stage. What I think we need to do, and this is coming out of me channeling with my colleagues, the Power Manifesto. The most successful transformation it was the basis of neoliberalism. It's been incredibly successful. The report card says it's been shocking, but they don't care about all those things. It's been incredibly successful in advancing the agenda that they set themselves in the early 70s. And so this is our agenda, a multi-layered capacity. We're going to create a think tank, which will be a consortium of think tanks that currently exist, including my own, the Centre for Full Employment, including the Cape York Institute. One of my partners in this, who's allowed me today to disclose that, is Noel Pearson. Noel Pearson, for those who don't know, was the lawyer who helped the Mabo decision. High-profile person. Tells me he gets on the phone to Scott Morrison. Noel rang me a while back that he'd bought my textbook, our textbook, and he said to me, if I had known this sort of stuff in the 80s, things would be a lot different. He'd accepted the economic mainstream. It's really powerful that we've got Noel in our consortium as an Indigenous leader, as a high-profile political player, and a really clever and nice guy. The other partner that I'm not allowed to disclose the name yet is a leading global climate action group. There's not too many of them. We've also got sociologists from academia. I've invited the leading ecological economist in Australia who's in this room to join our consortium. And we plan to create a think tank based upon that capacity along the lines of the Power Manifesto advocacy. We're going to create in Coffee, my research centre, the thing that's always constrained us is money. I have to compete for all the money I ever get, and it's not, and in scale of things, it's millions of dollars, not 50 millions of dollars. And so it means that we've always had to just do research, and I've got to be the marketing arm, and it's a bit of a problem, And so we're going to create this think tank. Will have a dissemination capacity other than the research capacity. It's going to be a propaganda machine with top-class marketing and press liaison. And all of the consortium partners have really close relationships with all the press. And so we're going to build on that, and we're going to be pumping out press releases to influence the debate. And it's unashamed we're going to be a propaganda institute, because that's the way the right wins. And we're going to have educational outreach. This is the MMTF project that I'm building and seeking funding for. And my first MMT effort is a masterclass in London on February 24th. It just got sold out. I'm really happy about that. And we're going to go out to all, not just Sydney and London and Tokyo and places. We're going to go out to Marywall and all sorts of off the normal urban path to educate and talk about MMT and about these issues, so that people are empowered, as I said yesterday, by knowledge. We're going to have we're aiming to provide logistic, financial and mental support for community action, because this is just going to be a facilitator in a sense. The only way it's going to work is if everyone in this room, plus everyone in every other room, be empowered to do stuff. Not necessarily what we want, specifically not as our agents, but as their agents. because what I understand is that I do a lot of work for community groups, and they've just got nothing, no strategic support. There are often a few retired people who are just trying to defend their communities, and they need logistic and skills. This group will provide them. And part of that will be I'm aiming to set up a power company. You can now do it. There's software available where we can set up. If you're on the national grid, you can join our power company, and we can run equity programs where those who have got generate too much power can give it away for free to people who deserve to have free power, who haven't got the income that others have in the collective. All of us could do that. We've got the technology to do that. And the aim is to put the big power companies out of business. And we're also going to have political engagement. So it's not just sitting out there pumping out propaganda. The aim is to actually grab them by the collar and get them to change their views, and to try to revitalise our political parties. And that's the political mobilisation. These things are still in incubation stage, let me add. And political mobilisation is, we're not yet talking about starting a political party, and I don't think that's going to come out of this initiative. But I know people that do want to start political parties and do want to steal people from existing political parties who are sick of them and want to start grassroots movements, and we might try to work out ways to help them. So we'll announce something, I hope, very big very soon as a national plan with global implications for Australia to marry NMT with climate action and green transition and provide a Power Manifesto version for progressives.